and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 494, His Master's Voice. Last week, we talked about a pair of technologies, the telegraph and landline telephone, which were hugely influential in their day, but which, in this day and age, have largely fallen by the technological wayside. I have to say I expected much the same to happen with our subject this week, but thanks in large part to hipsters everywhere, the record player is still going strong. The phonograph, as it was originally named, though it has also been called a gramophone, a record player, and more recently a turntable, is in terms of the physics behind it pretty straightforward. Sound, as we all recall from high school physics class, is created by the vibration of air molecules and can be charted in a waveform. The records and record players are essentially spiraled grooves etched into a malleable surface, with the shape of those grooves reflecting the waveform of a recorded sound. To play it back, you place a needle at the start of the groove, and as the needle moves through the spiraled groove, it vibrates in tune with the pattern of said groove, faintly reproducing the sound, which can then be amplified. The original patent for the phonograph, filed by the American inventor Thomas Edison on December 24, 1877, and accepted on February 18th of the next year, relied on playback using a horn that amplified the sound and made use of wax phonograph cylinders as the recording medium. As the decades went on, the technology was steadily improved, moving from cylinders to flat discs which were easier to store, improving the drive system of the turntable, refining the design of the needle for more accurate playback, and of course improving the sound systems it could be hooked into. Thankfully, as far as I know, hipsters have not tried to bring back the old-timey trumpet-style playback, though perhaps I am simply behind, or maybe ahead of the times. Now, Edison was not the first person to suggest the idea of recording sound waves. He had been beaten to the punch by not one, but two different Frenchmen. In 1857, an editor and typographer of scientific manuscripts named Edward Leon Scott de Martinville came up with the notion of making an expanded mechanical model of the human ear he called the phonautograph, which could be used to record sound waves onto a sheet of glass covered in lampblack, a type of black pigment. And just months before Edison completed his patent, another Frenchman, the poet and amateur scientist Charles Cros, deposited a sealed envelope with the French Academy of Sciences, outlining his idea for recording and reproducing sound using records made from metal. That whole envelope procedure was used to track who had come up with an idea first, in case any disputes arose on the issue later. He also gave it the absolutely awesome name Paleophone, roughly sounds from the past. However, de Martinville had no way to replay the sounds he recorded. They weren't actually played until the 2000s, when they were digitized by historians. Side note, it's actually thanks to de Martinville that we have the earliest recorded sound in human history, which is a recording of someone singing Au clair de la lune, or In the Light of the Moon. Charles Cros, meanwhile, was more interested in the scientific theory of recording sound than he was in creating something reproducible and marketable. After word of Edison's invention reached France, he did have that sealed envelope opened, so he could get some credit for his invention, but he didn't really press the issue beyond that. So it was Edison who got the credit for inventing the phonograph, though ironically he didn't foresee at all the main use it would be put to, the playing of music and other entertainments. Edison thought it was mostly going to be a business tool used for dictation or for speech training and the like. Now, thanks to the telegraph and the speedy transmission of information it enabled, word of this new invention was swift to reach Japan. As early as February 1877, so before Edison even filed his patent, the science magazine published by Yomiuri Shimbun, called Manabi no Akatsuki, or Dawn of Learning, carried an article describing the core concept of recording sound. The July 1878 edition of Bungaku Zashi, or the literary magazine, carried a description of the Edison patent and some discussion of how it worked. Just a few months later, Tokyo Imperial University devoted an entire 18-page issue of its scientific magazine, Gakuge Shirin, roughly Arts and Sciences from the Wider World, to explaining how Edison's invention worked, complete with diagrams. Finally, in 1880, a 92-page book called Kindaisei ni Daihatsume, Denwaki Sogenki, the two great inventions of the modern era, the telephone and the record player, was a major bestseller. This level of interest in just reading about the new device might seem odd, but once again, I think this is just an issue of us simply being used to the idea. Outside of some of the most remote areas on the planet, literally nobody alive remembers a time before recorded sound was not only possible, but fairly cheaply accessible. But you have to imagine that even with the quality issues of the first recordings, hearing that this was now possible felt, well, revolutionary. But what about seeing the technology in action? The first demonstration of a phonograph in Japan took place on March 28, 1879, at the Tokyo Shoho Kaigijo in Tokyo's Kobikicho neighborhood. This was essentially a convention center set up by the government to demonstrate the utility of new imported Western technology and to show off Japanese exports, such as they were at the time, to the rest of the world. The phonograph obviously qualified as a revolutionary new bit of technology, and so the Meiji government contracted one of its hired foreign instructors to demonstrate the new invention. The man they chose was James Ewing, a Scottish physicist who had been hired on to the mechanical engineering department at Tokyo Imperial University. Ewing was able to construct a functioning phonograph using diagrams published by Edison. He then gave a talk to the audience explaining how it worked, with interpretation provided by his Japanese colleagues. Ewing then recorded a song and played it back for the audience. Unfortunately, I could not find which one, and then called up a hitotsutosebushi, a type of folk singer, to record one as well. Both songs were played back successfully, much to the delight of the audience. Supposedly, Fukuchi Genichiro, head of the major daily Tokyo Nichi-Nichi Shimbun, then ran onto the stage and shouted into the recording apparatus, "Honna kikai ga dekiru to shinbunya wa komaru." If this invention works, newspapermen are screwed. Much of the delight to the assembled audience composed mostly of reporters. Fukuchi's own paper covered the demonstration with some breathless rhetoric, saying this device could, quote, store away people's words and then emit them 10 million ri away or 1,000 years later, unquote. Which again gives some sense of how revolutionary this all was, though Fukuchi ended up missing the mark with his notion the phonograph would end up in competition with print news media. That would have to wait for a new technological innovation, the radio. Now, despite the heated rhetoric about the promise of this revolutionary new technology, the earliest phonographs were kind of a mess. The English music critic Herman Klein, who saw a demonstration of the device in the early 1880s, had this to say about it, quote, "It sounded to my ear like someone singing about half a mile away, or talking at the other end of a big hall. But the effect was rather pleasant, save for a peculiar nasal quality due wholly to the mechanism." Recording for that primitive machine was a comparatively simple matter. I had to keep my mouth about 6 inches away from the horn and remember not to make my voice too loud if I wanted anything approximating a clear reproduction, that was all. When it was played over to me and I heard my own voice for the first time, 1 or 2 of my friends who were present said it rather sounded like mine. Others declared that they would never have recognized it. I dare say both opinions were correct. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but the technology would be refined over the course of the next decade, though not really by Edison, who by that point had moved on to other projects, most notably his war of currents against George Westinghouse to determine the electric standards of the United States. Those refinements, including improvements to the drive system and the switchover to disc records we'd recognize today, were modeled for Meiji government leaders in 1889 at the Rokumeikan, a Western-style pavilion built for state entertainments by the Meiji government. An assembled group of 200 dignitaries, including government veterans Ito Hirobumi and Inoue Kaoru, were treated to a recording made by Mutsu Munemitsu, the Japanese ambassador to Washington, D.C. The ambassador had recorded himself saying, quote, "I hereby introduce this machine. I believe this machine promises to be extremely useful, and so request that every effort be made to make it known throughout Japan." Supposedly, the audience was shocked by the quality of the recording, with several who knew Mutsu personally attesting it sounded like his voice. And this insistence on the immersive quality of recorded sound would be a major selling point for the first public demonstrations of the new technology. The very first public demonstration of the phonograph took place at the Imamiya Commerce Club in Osaka in January 1890. Here, the star, so to speak, was not a government official but kabuki performers, chiefly the venerated performer Ichikawa Danshiro IX, who was probably the single best-known actor of his generation, and also a dyed-in-the-wool man of Tokyo who did not leave the Kanto region ever, and never ever performed in Osaka or any other part of the Kansai area. And that meant, of course, that if you lived in Osaka, this might be the only chance to hear one of the great legends of the age perform. Several days of newspaper advertisements in the lead-up to the event ensured a packed hall, with the audience apparently being blown away to hear Ichikawa's performance, though one wonders how they were certain it was him. This pattern more or less repeated when the device was demonstrated in Kyoto in February and Shizuoka in March. Finally, in June, Tokyo itself got a demonstration of the phonograph, which took place at the Ozan Pavilion in Asakusa, near Sensoji and the Nakamisedore shopping arcade, though the pavilion no longer exists. This time, the recording was not of Ichikawa Danjiro, who, after all, someone living in Tokyo could just go see in person. Instead, the pavilion directors had paid kabuki actors performing at the nearby Ichimuraza Theater to record entire scenes from a famous play, Ehon Taikoki, and then played those back for an audience. Once again, the reviews were breathless and glowing. The Jiji Shinbun newspaper covering the exhibition wrote that, quote, "They all create the impression that if you close your eyes and listen as they reverberate throughout the pavilion, you might believe that the actors were dressed up in costume right in front of you. How delightful." The idea of sound quality, and especially the uniquely distinctive and individual qualities of someone's voice as the selling point for phonographs, is something you see repeated over and over again in this kind of coverage. Indeed, no less a person than the Meiji Emperor himself was apparently impressed by this. In one of his literally tens of thousands of poems, he wrote, "Ima koko ni hito no iru ka to omou made kometaru koe no sayaka naru kana." Is there a person here in front of me now? I think the voice inside the box is that clear. And if you've ever listened to any historical recordings, you're probably thinking some variation of what in the actual hell are these people talking about? If you haven't, go back and listen to some recordings from the 19th century. The sound quality is, to put it mildly, rough. There's not a wide range of frequency conveyed, so sound is very compressed, and a whole boatload of background noise. More often than not, it's hard to even understand what's being said, let alone appreciate the distinct timbre of someone's voice. One imagines a lot of the impression being made here is just the novelty of the thing itself, which after all was pretty unprecedented and, for lack of a better term, just very cool. It probably didn't hurt these early phonographs were also expensive and rare and thus desirable. Edison's 1890 model record player sold for $100, which would be about $3,440 today, so about on par with a pretty high-end sound system. And all of that produced what Kerem Yazar calls an audiophile placebo effect, the knowledge that you were listening to a famous person's voice, even if the recording itself was not of great quality, was enough to fire the imagination and get people to imagine a higher quality than what they were actually engaging with. And admittedly, even with its quality issues, historical audio is pretty fascinating. For example, some of the earliest recordings made of Japanese music date to 1903. The American recording engineer behind them, Fred Gaisberg, was a major figure in the Gramophone Company, what became RCA Victor in the US, and HMV in the UK. He was arguably one of the world's first record producers, and had been commissioned to record music all around the world to offer people an auditory tour of the globe, so to speak. During his time in Japan, he recorded everything from simple shamisen performers to a 12-person gagaku ensemble performing the courtly music that had been a staple of the imperial court for over 1,000 years. The recordings, frankly, do not sound great. They have since been digitized, so you can listen to them online, but they are a fascinating window into the history of Japanese music, and the gagaku ones, for example, still get used today by gagaku performers and researchers attempting to study traditional music history in Japan. For most, the major issue was not audio quality. After all, what did they have to compare it to? But cost. And for costs to come down and for the phonograph to really become part of people's daily lives, to lose that edge of novelty, Japan would have to start making its own models domestically. In 1891, a watchmaker in Aichi Prefecture by the name of Chujo Yujiro did just that. The very next year, a book publisher named Hasegawa Takejiro, who had hired engineers to reverse engineer American-built phonographs, began selling his own as well. His company, Tenshodo, began to compete against the first phonograph dealers in Japan, Sankodo, which had been set up in Tokyo in 1899, at first importing American-made phonographs before beginning to produce its own. Fun fact, one of the original founding partners was none other than Katayama Sen, a socialist and one of the founding members of both the American and Japanese Communist parties. By the start of the 20th century, Sankodo and Tenshodo were in steep competition with each other, selling their own domestically produced phonographs as well as records, which were still mostly being produced overseas. They would eventually be joined by Nichibe Chikuonki Seizo Kabushiki Gaisha, or the Japan-America Phonograph Manufacturing Company, the brainchild of an American living in Japan named Frederick Horn. Horn had initially been a technology importer, but decided to focus specifically on the phonograph in 1909. 1 year later, he renamed his company and dropped the America part from the name to appeal more to domestic patriotic sentiment. Nichiku, as it was known for short, would become a major player in the Japanese phonographic market, though it would never lose its American roots and would eventually form a joint venture with the American firm Columbia Records. As more and more companies entered into the market, prices became more affordable, but still steep. A record could retail for anything from 5 sen to 1 yen, at a time when, say, an average meal cost 15 sen. Those steep costs in turn produced a rather interesting turn of events. Japan did have a Western-style copyright law on the books as part of its civil code, but as it was first written in 1896, the civil code focused on text copyrights. It was unclear if the law also applied to recorded sound. And this created a massive market for, in essence, piracy. Semi-legal firms would buy imported records, make copies of them, and sell them for around 1/3 of the initial price, and legally, given the status of copyright law, it wasn't really clear whether there was much actual record companies could do about this. There were several lawsuits in the 1910s filed by record companies to try and protect their copyrights, which were largely unsuccessful. Instead, these companies had to try and compete on quality, God forbid, introducing innovations like the double-sided record in 1912 and slashing their own costs to try and match the prices set by the pirates. Now, you might have noticed that kabuki was a big source of early promotion for phonographs, with records of famous performers and performances being used to demonstrate the fidelity, such as it was, of the new invention. But actually, the earliest records produced and sold domestically in Japan were not of kabuki. They were mostly folk music, particularly a very popular genre at the time known as naniwabushi. This was largely because of the technology available at the moment. The records of the time could only hold about 3 minutes of audio per side, which is, of course, a lot less than your average kabuki play or even your average scene from a famous kabuki play. Recording equipment was also not of great quality. Even if you tried to record a live performance, the audio quality would be atrocious. And if you had actors come into a studio and record, you would lose a lot of the energy that makes actual kabuki so vital and interesting. It would take until the 1920s for record technology to catch up to the point where kabuki was viable to record and play, and by then other forms of performance had established a more dominant position in the recording industry. Kabuki never went away entirely, of course. After the start of the Pacific War, for example, domestic record companies made a massive push to record kabuki performances of Chushin Gura, the classic tale of the 47 Ronin, as a way of making some money off of the upwelling of patriotic and militarist sentiment among the population. Naniwabushi and folk music in general are, in contrast, much better suited to this limited format. Naniwabushi in particular is absolutely fascinating as a cultural form. It involves a sort of lead singer who would alternate between improvised singing and pure narration, accompanied by a shamisen player who would both provide background music and occasionally their own interjections, which both help move the narrative along and keep time. The form originated alongside yosei, the varieties of narrative storytelling that developed in the Edo period. Naniwabushi would often share the stage with the rakugo storytellers we've talked about in the past. Individual songs were, of course, comparatively easy to record and well suited to those short early records. Unlike kabuki, where the language of the popular plays is often from the Edo period and thus can be a bit tricky to decipher from a modern standpoint unless you're more familiar with traditional vocabulary, Naniwabushi songs were entirely contemporary in their wording. Beyond this, the performances themselves offered one of the same selling points those early kabuki demonstrations did: star power. The jazz-like quality of Naniwabushi, where a good chunk of what happens is improvised along the pattern of an existing song, lent itself well to star power, so to speak. A particular performer might have a specific approach to improvisation that was famous, or a certain song that was especially well known, and record companies could market around that. In that sense, because of its ability to create what were in essence popular music icons, Naniwabushi laid the groundwork for the entire history of Japanese popular music over the course of the 20th century. Now, the content of Naniwabushi tends towards the melancholy. These were often not particularly happy songs, and instead focused on drama and personal hardship and the overcoming thereof. Often the music had a particularly nationalistic bent as well. For example, many of these songs extolled the virtue of joining the Japanese military and serving the nation, leaving aside your tragic personal concerns for the benefit of the Japanese community. Figures like General Nogi Maresuke, who alongside his wife committed suicide to follow the Meiji Emperor to the grave, were played up in Naniwabushi narratives as romantic folk heroes expressing the true essence of Japanese identity. It's not quite clear why Naniwabushi, which did not have such explicitly political overtones from the start, began to take them on in the early 20th century. Perhaps artists were concerned about avoiding government censorship and simply overcorrected. Perhaps they were swept up in the general sense of patriotic martial nationalism, which swept the country after its victories in wars against China and Russia. It's not really clear. Still, the songs were not exclusively nationalistic propaganda. Many of them included references to the sorrows and hardships of working people, leading to more than a few comparisons with a uniquely American form of music, blues. Now, perhaps the greatest superstar of the age, and really the first star in Japan created by the record business, was one Tochuken Kumoemon, born in 1878. His birth name is a bit unclear. I've seen it given as both Okamoto Minakichi and Yamamoto Kozo. His family were performers by trade, his mother was a shamisen player, and his father was a yosei narrator of religious tales. Apparently the son inherited the parents' talent for stagecraft. He was apprenticed to a folk singer at a young age, and quickly proved to have a flair for showmanship. In 1907, Tochuken was able to land a spot at the Hongoza Theater in Tokyo, which in turn sold well enough to bring him to the attention of record companies. Now, Tochuken Kumoemon was not the first such Naniwabushi to be offered a deal like this. Indeed, his great-grandson would share a bit of family lore a few decades later that the only reason Kumoemon took the deal was because one of his most immediate rivals had also been offered a record deal, and he didn't want to miss out and be shown up by said rival. However, if that was the case, he didn't need to worry. Record sales made Tochuken Kumoemon one of the most recognized musicians in all of Japan. His combination of performative skill as well as his personality, boisterous and over the top, including a truly wild look with his hair often unkempt and unbound, gave him, for lack of a better word, a rock star energy that sold very well. It did help, also, that Tochuken himself was a bit of a drama magnet, and that personality did just as much to help sell his records as anything else. The man was a wild partier, and his family life was something of a shambles. His first marriage failed because he spent so much time on his performances, and his relationship with his son apparently was a train wreck. But that only enhanced his popularity. After all, Naniwabushi songs were about hard times in life, and clearly this guy knew his hard times. The drama also helped keep his name in headlines. For example, after his first marriage failed, Tochuken ended up seducing the wife of one of his teachers, Ohama was her name, and eloping with her, which caused a massive scandal both for the usual reasons, and because Ohama was an extremely talented shamisen accompanist, and by seducing her, Tochuken Kumoemon had essentially stolen her for his act. Apparently, the whole thing was such a scandal the newlyweds had to leave Tokyo for several months to escape the spotlight, while they waited for everything to die down. Now, Tochuken Kumoemon's star would not last very long. His life of hard partying caught up to him and led him to an early grave in 1916. But his style remained very influential on popular music in Japan, particularly the loosely defined genre of ryukoka, or popular music, essentially a mixture of Japanese performance styles with westernized music sensibilities, the foundation of Japanese pop music. That, however, is a whole other tale from the one we are telling here. What matters for us is that Tochuken Kumoemon's star was essentially made by the phonograph just a few decades after it was commercially introduced, a real indicator of how quickly the technology caught on, even with the limitations of the period. And this is all the more impressive when you consider that personal ownership of phonographs remains something of a rarity during this time period. Generally speaking, very few households in Japan could afford appliances in the early 20th century, and even if they could, there was still a massive limiting factor: the availability of electricity. As most of our older listeners, and probably none of our younger ones, know, a landline phone works on its own without electricity, but phonographs were among the first household consumer goods, alongside clothing irons, washing machines, electric stoves, and refrigerators, which required a home to be hooked up to an electric grid in order to run. In places like the United States with substantial deposits of oil and coal, as well as many rivers for hydroelectricity, this was much less of a limiting factor before the Second World War. But Japan is very poor in oil and gas, and what little there was went first and foremost to the military and to industrial uses. This was compounded by a hugely fragmented electricity market, with some 700 different electric utilities competing with each other before World War I. None could really offer good economies of scale as a result. Electricity was therefore hideously expensive, so even if you could afford to buy a physical phonograph player, you might not be able to afford to turn it on. One anecdote from 1924 illustrates this well. The executive Shibusawa Hideo, son of the famous entrepreneur Shibusawa Eiichi, was working on developing Dennen Chofu, a neighborhood of Ota in southern Tokyo his father had bought in order to turn into a British-style garden suburb. In the offing, Shibusawa Hideo had ordered the construction of a model home to demonstrate the promise of his new suburb, complete with an electric stove, washing machine, and even a vacuum cleaner. However, when he was then informed of how much it would cost for an interested consumer to plug in and run these devices, he decided to pull all three from his model home. Otherwise, he said, potential consumers would not be intrigued by the promise of modern living, but furious at their potential bills. It's hard to guess how much the potential cost impacted adoption of the phonograph, but we do have a few solid guesses. The American academic Andrew Gordon estimates that by 1930, 5% of Japanese families owned a radio, which required electricity, and that phonographs were even less widely adopted. It was not until the 1950s, when the mass electrification of the Japanese countryside, combined with cheaper power thanks to preferential deals with the US for coal and oil, made owning a household phonograph more common. By the mid-50s, about 20% of Japanese households owned one. But then how were people listening to phonographs enough to make musicians into stars if they couldn't afford their own? The answer were phonograph clubs, essentially bars and cafes where customers could also make use of a player, in the same way today you might grab a drip coffee so that you can make use of the complimentary Wi-Fi. These cafes could be tastemakers in a sense for the music scene in Japan. Since the owners could afford more records than an average person might be able to, and so were willing to take a flyer on more experimental imports in particular, this was how many unusual genres got introduced to Japan. For example, if you ever wondered why Japan has such a big jazz scene, that's actually from the post-war era cafes. Young people were looking for something new, and knowing that wartime governments had banned American music, went looking to places that played American records. Jazz in particular caught on big at the cafes that were playing it. That's why Japan today has one of the largest jazz scenes on the planet outside the US. The more dedicated enthusiast might join a phonograph society of fellow audiophiles, who then between them could afford the bills for a single device, as well as their own record collection, because remember, imported records could get expensive. By the 40s, around 100 yen for a particularly rare and in-demand one was not unusual. The phonograph in all its many forms did come under substantial pressure during the 30s and 40s, particularly after a national spiritual mobilization announced in 1937 to support Japan's war in China. To mobilize patriotic sentiment, the government, by this point dominated by the military, began to lean on record producers to focus on more patriotic content, and on import companies to avoid music from countries outside friendly nations like Germany and Italy. Music that was not extremely patriotic, and especially anything foreign, was viewed with suspicion and potentially as spiritually detrimental to the war effort. Thus, well before it approached anything close to mass adoption in the Japanese household, the phonograph was already having a recognizable impact on Japanese society, enough that government agents saw it as a vehicle for mass mobilization during the war years. Frankly, it's not hard to understand why. Think how much time you spend listening to the music you like. Hell, think how much your opinion of someone you might meet changes based on your knowledge of their musical preferences. Music tastes are very personal, and your ability to define yourself with them is very powerful. And that, I think, was the true power of the phonograph. Finding yourself musically and finding other people who like the things you do. That's why, in Japan, and everywhere else, from the beginning, it's been something people have been truly fascinated by. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Linnert, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week when we wrap this little mini-series up with a look at the history of the radio.